This is Dennis Orthman from SMI, and I want to thank you for joining this SMI to You webinar entitled Cybersecurity in the Healthcare Supply Chain. I'm pleased to be a host and a participant for today's webinar session. Today we have over 50 connections that are participating in this session, and SMI is thankful that you all could find the time to be a part of today's webinar. Before I introduce our presenter, I'd like to go over just a few housekeeping items. First, all attendees for today's session are in listen-only mode in order to eliminate any background noises and ensure audio clarity for everyone. The voices that you'll hear today are my own voice and the voice of our presenter, Mac McMillan. Although you're all in a listen-only mode, we are interested in your questions. The webinar technology does allow for attendees to submit questions using the questions feature in the control panel. You're encouraged to submit questions at any time during today's session. And when we finish the presentation, if time allows, I'll then read the submitted questions and Mac will try his best to answer them. Today's session will be approximately 1 hour in length, depending upon the number of questions submitted. The slides that you see today will be provided to all attendees after today's session, and we're also recording this webinar, and SMI will make that recording available on demand via our website. Lastly, at the conclusion of our webinar, all attendees, your screens will automatically be directed to a post-webinar survey via the GoToWebinar system. I want to encourage you to complete the survey, as your feedback is important to help SMI's efforts to continue to improve our webinar program. Now I am pleased to introduce to you our presenter, Mac McMillan. Mac is the CEO of CynergisTek Incorporated, a top-ranked information security and privacy consulting firm. Mac is chair of the HIMSS Privacy and Security Policy Task Force and brings nearly 40 years of experience from both government and private sector positions. He's worked in the healthcare industry since his retirement from the federal government, and he contributes regularly to thought leadership around compliance, security, and privacy in healthcare. I'm pleased to welcome Mac as today's presenter. All yours, Mac.
Thank you, sir, and hello, everybody. We'll get started here. Let me go past the first couple of slides that are in there, and they'll be in the deck for information purposes. If you want to look at those afterwards, just an overview of obviously my background and the company's background that I manage. Today's topic is a particularly interesting one in that I think everybody who works in healthcare today is probably heard or experienced firsthand a lot of the events that are going on today with respect to cybercrime and cyber security. And it's not a day goes by that I don't have a conversation with somebody in the industry about an incident that they have had or experienced or have heard about and that they want to understand a little bit better. And today, hopefully, we're going to go through some of that and talk about those things and provide all of you a better understanding or a better appreciation for the kinds of things that are happening in our industry today and the kinds of threat that we face as an industry and how that applies not only to our organic systems and networks, but also to our extended supply chain that we rely on so heavily today in many instances to get the mission done. So we're going to talk about what's changed, why this is happening, and why we're seeing more and more of it. We're going to talk about cybersecurity from the threat perspective and what that threat looks like today and how that threat actually does the things that it does and why it's being probably more effective today than it has been in the past and what we need to do about that. We're going to talk a little bit about how some of the things that we can do to respond and how that affects the supply chain in particular and what we can expect from covered entities, I think, going forward. I had some very interesting discussions even this week at 3 different hospitals that have who all experienced either ransomware or other virus or malware related attacks that caused some level of disruption in their environments, and at least 2 out of the 3 of those were the result of a vendor, not their own. And how they're thinking about that today and what that means for how they how they view their supply chain and the vendors that they work with, and then talk a little bit about what's next and what we can expect, and hopefully throughout you guys will be able to ask questions. So first of all, why are we where we are today? And it's really really very simple. It's a direct connection between what we've done in our industry with respect to systems and data, and what the cyber criminals have done with respect to how they've changed in terms of their attack tactics and whatnot. And what I mean by that is from 2009 on, essentially from the implementation of meaningful use, where we started literally requiring organizations to digitize all of their patient information, we began to put all of that very valuable information into a form that then made it susceptible to compromise from cybercrime. Today we have a very complex environment, as you all know, that is much different than the environment we had just a decade ago or 15 years ago, where we are doing far more with our systems as it relates to operations, and we're far more reliant on our data and those systems than we ever have been in the past. And any disruption or corruption of that environment or that information can cause disruption in our operations. Our environment is also far more complex than it was when this all started. When we think back in terms of the first security requirements that came out under HIPAA, in the sense that at that time in 2005, I don't know how many of y'all realize it, but the iPhone hadn't even been invented yet. It wasn't even out on the market. There was no such thing as an iPad or a pad that we use. Many of us use in our environments today. The whole concept of networkable and Wi-Fi connected medical devices wasn't in place yet. Many of the things that we have today that are making our environment far more complex and harder to protect, like mobile devices, like medical devices, like telemedicine, like portals and pads and whatnot. A lot of these things weren't even in place when those rules first came out. We didn't have cloud, for instance, we didn't have the same level of software as a service type vendor relationships that we have today. So our environment is far more complex than it was when these things first came out. And what's happened, unfortunately, is that a lot of the security that was related to how we manage technology didn't keep up with the technology itself, and it has now put us in a position where we're trying to play catch up, and in many instances, it's put us at a high degree of risk. And on top of that, the number of people that are actually accessing our systems today and touching our data, and the amount of data that's actually flowing outside of our environment to third parties who are providing critical services as part of our operations, and you just increase the amount of risk that an organization has to manage even further. And that's kind of sort of where we are today, and that's what's made it more difficult, and that's what's made it such a lucrative target in terms of what the threat sees. When you look at the top threats in healthcare today, they really haven't changed much as it relates to the top three. Theft and loss still accounts for almost 50% of our losses in data today, in terms of the number of events, not the amount of information, but in terms of the number of events, it still accounts for a very high percentage. And this is laptops that get lost that aren't encrypted. This is things, servers, it's devices, it's information that is somehow lost or stolen out of our environment or from our vendors. In fact, one of the hospitals this week that we were talking to, one of the two issues that they had was a laptop that belonged to a vendor that wasn't encrypted that was stolen. Insider abuse continues to rise. It rises about 20% every year, believe it or not, with respect to the number of incidents that occur that involve an insider. a very high percentage of incidents that we have actually involve our staff, but there's about 15% of those incidents that are especially troubling because they involve some form of identity theft or medical identity theft, which is far more damaging than just simple loss or theft of data. And then we have the ever-present unintentional action, things that happen by virtue of mistakes or unintentional incidents. So somebody actually trying to do the right thing or doing things with the right intention in mind, but unfortunately bypassing a step or a control or a security requirement in putting the information at risk, or something that doesn't get addressed properly, something that gets disabled or opened for some purpose, and somebody fails to re-enable it. But the last category is the one that we're going to talk about today, and it's the one that's really the most troubling, because we've actually seen this part of our threat environment grow exponentially in the last 18 to 24 months. You all, I know, recall that as early as the middle of 2014, we began to see the major breaches that were occurring that affected folks like Anthem and Primera and Community Health. And that was kind of the start, if you will, in terms of the realization that we had a growing number of what we call advanced persistent threats that were beginning to affect the healthcare industry. That continued to grow in 2015. In the latter part of 2015, the beginning of 2016, we saw the reintroduction of ransomware in a big way, and in zero-day virus attacks. And you saw these at the hospital out in California. You saw it at the hospital down in Texas, and the hospital in Kentucky here just in the last couple of days, and Hurley Medical up in Flint, Michigan, all of which were the victims of advanced threats, very sophisticated attacks that used what we call zero-day attacks, meaning there was no signature for those attacks. They had never been seen before in the environment, and so many of the systems that watch for those kinds of things weren't even capable of detecting them. And so they were, and add to that some other factors that made those organizations more susceptible to compromise, and it just turned into a very, very negative situation. What's interesting about that is that while you've heard about those 4 incidents, because they all made it into the press, what you may not know is that that's really literally the tip of the iceberg. And what I mean by that is literally we have heard over and over again from countless hospitals over the last month and a half that they have seen an absolute increase in the number of attacks that their systems are beginning to detect. And in many instances, many hospitals have had other ransomware attacks and virus attacks that have had limited impact in their environment. And there's a reason for that too. And I'll talk about that a little bit later in terms of why do some people have these events and they turn into incredibly disruptive events, and others have these same events and they're less disruptive. And there's very good reasons for that in terms of level of preparation, if you will, for these things. But the thing that's important to take away from this discussion is that these attacks are growing exponentially. I was talking to several of our hospitals and some of the security operations centers that monitor health systems, and looking at just ransomware attacks as a single category. And the organizations that actually monitor those things keep statistics. And one of the things that they noticed that from the end of 2015 through the first quarter so far of 2016, that the average number of ransomware attacks that systems are detecting on networks today has grown tenfold. It has gone from about 3,000 attacks a month to nearly 30,000 attacks a month. And that's just one category. And obviously the reason we believe that we're seeing such an increase in those attacks is because they're being somewhat successful. And the cyber criminals, like all other kinds of criminals, go where there is success and where they're having an impact, and that's exactly what they're doing. So let's talk about that cybersecurity landscape. This timeline is one that I put together recently for another presentation, and it actually demonstrates how things have changed from the time that that meaningful use and the High-Tech Act came out, and we began to literally digitize all of our data, and the advent of HIEs and other and accountable care organizations and other kinds of sharing relationships that have created greater access, if you will, to our information, as well as the beginnings of what I call a real migration of services and function and data out to third-party providers, as well as to the cloud. And you notice that in around 2009 to 2011, we were still, for the most part, seeing theft and loss as the primary means of data being stolen or lost. But as of 2012, and especially 2012 on, you notice that the number of incidents that we began to see, and the severity of those incidents, began to migrate very quickly to the cyber criminal or the cybercrime side of things, and to hacking. And we began to see not only more of those types of events, but we began to see more sophisticated attacks, and we began to see more different types of those attacks than we ever had before. A lot of the attacks that we hadn't seen in healthcare, but we were seeing in the government space, for instance, or in higher education, or in technology, or retail, or finance, we hadn't quite seen in healthcare. But starting 2013, all of those different types of attacks began to show up in healthcare, to the point where today, and for the last 2 years running, healthcare has been the #1 industry with respect to these kinds of attacks. So what's changing about the threat itself? Well, we now have attacks that are coming at us that are focused on financial crime, meaning somebody trying to steal information that they can then monetize on the black market, or steal something of value in terms of actual dollars, in terms of attacks that attack financial institutions and create deposits outside of our system that go to a hacker site, if you will. We see espionage in healthcare, and a lot of people don't think about espionage in healthcare because they think when they think espionage, they think spies, and they think the government. But yet there is actual espionage that goes on in the industrial sector as well. And a lot of that espionage that we see, particularly in healthcare, is focused on personal information in terms of what it tells us about about folks that somebody might be interested in. It's information about processes. It's information about new procedures. It's information about new techniques, about new medicines, about new cures. Especially in the pharmaceutical industry, there's a big focus on learning new formulary for medicines, etc. So healthcare has its own form of industrial espionage that goes on, as well as state-sponsored espionage that's looking for things that other countries want to know about our general state of health in this country. We've also seen hacktivism now in a big way. We saw hacktivism at Boston Children's Hospital in a child custody case. We've seen hacktivism with Hurley Medical up in Flint, Michigan over the water crisis. We've seen other kinds of hacktivism in the industry as well. So these are people that are actually hacking systems not for money, not to commit a crime, but to create an impact or to respond to an issue that they think they want to make a statement about. And then last but not least, we have the advanced persistent threats. And these advanced persistent threats are that are the more sophisticated threats. These are the ones where you've heard so-and-so was compromised, and the hackers were on their network for 18 months before they were discovered, or 9 months before they were discovered, or 12 months before the incident occurred, what have you. And these are the ones that are especially damaging, because this is where you have a very sophisticated threat or a very sophisticated organization that has the resources and the time and the focus to exploit your environment and to steal. In many cases, this is where we have our greatest loss of information, if you will, in theft. If you look at the evolution of attacks that we've seen in our industry, we've also seen that evolve as well. Most of our attacks that we saw early on were in the nuisance or data theft category. They quickly ramped into cybercrime with the advent of the ability to commit fraud, and especially medical identity theft and identity theft in terms of using that information for financial gain. We then moved into the hacktivist realm, which I talked about, which is really all about making an issue out of something. And then last but not least, we've seen the destructive attacks. And these are attacks like we've seen with the ransomware variant, where even though they have a cybercrime or a financial spin to them, they're also incredibly disruptive in that they create an inability for us to either use our systems or to use our data, and therefore they are truly impactful to operations. Why is this possible? Well, the reason this is possible is because cybercrime, as we know it today, has really become a business. And we're going to talk about where these folks do business in a moment. But today we have, just like we have software as a service or infrastructure as a service, if you will, or hosting services, you can actually go out there and you can have cybercrime as a service model. There are a lot of folks who are engaging, criminal folks who are engaging in cybercrime activity who do not have the technical capability themselves to carry out these attacks, but they can go to the dark web and they can go to the black market and they can actually acquire these services for a price. The dark web, as we're going to talk about in a minute, has really made it possible for the bad guys to monetize the stolen data that they steal from us. Think of it as a huge marketplace where you can buy virtually anything that you want or desire with respect to either stolen data, stolen identities, services, to steal information, tools or techniques for doing it yourself. There's education out there for those who want to learn how to do it or learn how to run a phishing campaign effectively, etc. It is an incredibly thriving market that is becoming more and more sophisticated as the good guys are attacking that market and trying to catch those folks. They're becoming even more sophisticated in how they do things and even harder to actually track down. The other thing that we're seeing is that even basic cyber criminals are now adopting more advanced techniques, meaning more of the advanced persistent threat approach, more of the very methodical attack approach that is much harder to detect. Usually snatch and grab, or breaking and entering, if you will, are much easier to detect because the bad guy is usually making noise when he's coming in, and he's not really paying attention or caring about whether he's seen or not, because he's really coming in and it's a target of opportunity, and he's grabbing whatever is available and he's getting out hopefully before he gets caught. And a lot of cybercrime is conducted in just that manner. But these more advanced threats are not. They're very sophisticated. There's a lot of reconnaissance involved. There are tools involved that they are very careful about what they do. They tend to surveil a target for a long period of time, even after they perhaps compromise that target or exploit that target. They may literally sit there for months and just do reconnaissance inside the network and see what's going on and see what's working and see what security features are actually present, or how well the organization actually monitors its environment, how it reacts to certain things. And then they'll methodically go about disabling those controls that make it harder to detect them and to deploy the tools they need to do whatever it is they're going to do, and then carry out their attack. So it's a very methodical, very sophisticated, very quiet attack that's much, much harder to detect. Where they do this is on what we call the dark web or the black market. And, you know, I hate to say it, but the fact of the matter is that today, with very little sophistication, somebody who can get out there and can learn how to do a lot of this stuff without a lot of training, and you can, you know, if you establish yourself a Bitcoin wallet, PGP for encryption in terms of your communications, and get a hold of what's called a Tor browser, which is the network that they use in the underground, then you're in business essentially. And you can see by the graphic here, these are actual pages from the dark web. And you know, this one here is called Alpha Bay Market, and you can see how you can actually acquire identities. You can acquire histories, financial histories, etc. And these are all things that someone can get out there and acquire and then use to commit identity theft. And so basically, this is why this information has become so valuable. They can steal identity information from us in healthcare. They can take it out there, put it on the dark web, and they can sell it over and over again for criminals to use and take advantage of. So let's talk about one of the first scenarios that we have out there that we are absolutely seeing a lot of right now, and that's cyber extortion. First appeared around 2005. There are literally two forms of ransomware. The first one is crypto, which actually encrypts the data itself. The second is called locker, which actually encrypts the operating system or the application, if you will, and it denies us the use of our system. So we can have ransomware attacks that deny us use of a particular system or our network, or we can have ransomware that actually denies us access to our data. Most of these sophisticated attacks now use their own encryption for the infection. So they use very advanced encryption algorithms for encrypting the data. Many of the more recent variants of cryptoware eliminate the shadow file that used to be there that some people use to recover from a ransomware attack. And so they make it virtually impossible for the organization to decrypt their data. They either have to get the key to unencrypt it, or they have to take it down and rebuild it and replace it with a backup. They use industrial strength encryption on the stuff that they do and their communications, so that it can't be broken. And they enable the privacy of their communications through the Tor network and through the Bitcoin payment system, so that it's virtually impossible to track. and so it makes it very difficult to break these attacks, and it makes it very directly, and it makes it very difficult to track or to catch the individuals who are causing the attack. Generally speaking, they are indifferent to the target. They are not out there specifically looking for any one person or any one type of organization. There are attacks that are written to attack certain types of industries or certain types of information, but they're not so specific as I'm going after this hospital in this location and this information. It's typically this kind of information on these kind of organizations across the board, and it's anybody who's connected to the internet and who has a vulnerability that has not been addressed that potentially can be exploited by whatever their attack method is. Many of these come through malvertising, so organizations that allow their employees to go to websites on their business computers are always going to be at risk of malware unless they have other protections in place that filter that traffic and review those sites and control what those individuals are able to download and execute. Many of these sites are legitimate sites, people going to legitimate sites that they would never expect malware to be associated with. And then the malware is associated with a pop-up window that comes up that looks like it belongs to that particular site, so they don't suspect it, or it's an attachment. Many of the malware that we're seeing today are coming through email attachments. Many of the email attacks that are run look like very legitimate emails from, in many cases, someone even internal to their own organization that has an attachment. When they click on the attachment, it downloads the malware and they're infected. And then a lot of this stuff comes through downloaders or botnets that are literally sitting out there in the internet and basically communicating these things continuously, just looking for somebody to come along and inadvertently download some of their material. Many of these are often associated with sites that are, quote, less desirable in the business environment. But unless those sites are effectively blocked, then it's very, very likely that this kind of activity could occur. And then last but not least, we have the attacks that come through social engineering, as well as through social websites and social media. There are a lot of attacks that are associated with things like LinkedIn, Facebook, etc. today, so that individuals need to be incredibly careful about who they connect to or what they connect on or what they download or open. And these are sites, again, that people think of as having a legitimate purpose in business, like LinkedIn as an example, but that could very well be transmitting malware or have malware associated with them that could infect their environment. So it's very difficult. This stuff is coming at us from many different directions, and it has many ways of getting into our environment. Talk about cyber espionage. Cyber espionage is, for the most part, is carried out by nation-state actors for political purposes. It can be carried out by other businesses. It's not as common for one business to commit cyber espionage against another as it is for nation-states to do this, but we're seeing a real increase in nation-state cyber espionage activity, primarily because it is an easy source of information. So if you want to understand better where the United States is with respect to disease or infection or medical care, if you will, if you're a foreign intelligence service, where better to attack than the health industry? They have all that information. If you want to know about the backgrounds of individuals that may be assigned to various government organizations, who better to attack than the Office of Personnel Management that runs the majority of all the background investigations for federal workers. And this is exactly what we're seeing. They may be attacking a healthcare organization for some purpose that is completely disconnected from cybercrime. They may be literally attacking for the purpose of gaining access to that information so that they can do other analysis. And when you look at some of the more sophisticated attacks that have occurred that have involved some of the other organizations like the Chinese Panda organization, that's exactly what we believe that they were up to. The reason they wanted to steal all that information for the most part was so that they could do intelligence gathering with respect to that information about where the United States is generally in terms of the health of its population, its perhaps techniques that it has, or other information that has value to them as a nation that doesn't mind getting involved in espionage for gaining information. Hacktivism, I talked about earlier. Hacktivism takes many different faces. In some cases, it takes a personal conscience face, like the Edward Snowden affair, where an individual became disgruntled with the way the organization he was working with the government, and he decided to steal information and then to expose that. You had Ghost Shell, who came out in 2015 and attacked multiple universities out there who were involved in various forms of research and other activities, and leaked that information. As I talked about earlier, Anonymous hacked the Boston Children's Hospital over a child custody incident, and Hurley Medical just recently was attacked as a result of the water situation in Flint, Michigan. We've also had hospitals who have had their websites defaced and taken down and replaced by pro-ISIS propaganda groups, which is obviously something you really don't want to come to work Monday morning and find when you go to your local hospital website, and all of a sudden you see a pro-ISIS group marching across the screen and rhetoric being shouted at you across the box. But this is something that we've seen more and more. So it doesn't have to be somebody coming after us for financial reasons. It doesn't have to be somebody coming after us even for the data itself. It could be somebody that's literally just unhappy with what's going on in the community that we live in, or unhappy with our role in a particular situation, and decides to make an example. Those advanced persistent threats that we talked about, which are in many ways start with some type of a malware attack. When you look at just the evolution of malware itself, you can see by the graphic there that if you go back to 2006, we were looking basically at 200,000 new malware a year, whereas last year we literally saw as many as 1 million new malware a day. That is an incredible number of malware attacks that are being produced and released into the wild, that all of us are susceptible to. The reason that number has jumped up so demonstrably is that somewhere around 2010 to 2012 timeframe, we began to see a real shift from the old-fashioned way of creating malware, meaning somebody out there writing a piece of code and then releasing it, to botnets, that basically computers that now generate malicious code, as well as variants to that code, and release that code, just continue to sit there and create new malicious code and release it over and over again into the network, which just the automation of that process has just made it that much more that much more productive, and made it that much more difficult for us to track. These APTs, as I said before, are really highly sophisticated. They use multiple attack vectors to get in. They will use one of their most favorite attack vectors today is through phishing and spear phishing. And this, of course, is the an attack on human beings, not an attack on systems. They are mimicking emails or websites or what have you that folks frequent or receive, with the hope that the individual will click on that site or click on that mail or click on the attachment and either give up something of value, their credentials, or just download the malware itself. Many of the attacks that we see today are literally they literally start with something as simple as an email that a user clicks on, downloads a piece of malware that then infects a system, allows the hacker to get a foothold, who then takes the time to slowly but surely exploit that environment and to download other tools and to then carry out their attack. The other problem with a lot of these malware is that a lot of times they attach themselves to the kernel of the environment, meaning the very root of our system, so that when we find one and we take down that server or we take down that workstation and we rebuild and we reinstall it and we think we've solved the problem, all of a sudden it pops up somewhere else. And the reason it pops up somewhere else is because we really didn't find the malware itself. And so a lot of times the level of sophistication in terms of forensics that organizations have to do today to actually find some of these attacks is far more advanced than what they were faced with in the past. And you actually need organizations that have the capability to do advanced forensic analysis in your environment to help you actually find where these attacks are and root them out so that you can literally eventually isolate them and remove them so that they're not continuing to infect. And that's why a lot of organizations actually were affected by some attack and responded to that attack and actually cleaned it up with respect to the servers or the workstations that they initially saw, but didn't find the actual root cause of the attack. The attacker, aware that they had cleaned up those systems, basically sat there quietly and then moved to other parts of the network to continue to carry out that attack. And that's why they're called advanced persistent threats, because they're relentless, and they seem to keep coming back. These are the kinds of attacks that we saw with Anthem, with UCLA, with Primera, and they led to massive data breaches as a result of the hacker having many months to work within the environment to disable the things that they needed to disable that enabled them to steal that information and then to eventually carry out those attacks. A lot of these are associated with what we call zero-day attacks, meaning we don't have the signatures for them. Many of the attacks that we just saw recently with respect to Hollywood Presbyterian as an example, and with Hurley, were actually zero-day attacks. So even if they had been running up-to-date antivirus, etc., it would not have caught it because they didn't have the signatures for it. But there are systems out there that actually look for anomalous signatures, meaning signatures they don't recognize, and actually do alert on those or block those. And those are the kinds of technologies that we need to be investing in today because the old signature-based technologies are not adequate. I'm not going to go through this in detail, but if you're, basically what it shows you is that these attacks have just gotten much more sophisticated in what they do, and this kind of shows you the path of one of these attacks in the environment. And this timeline that you're looking at here, even though there's no time associated with it, can actually be over months, so that a lot of these events actually are very imperceptible if we don't have advanced detection capabilities running in our environment, because the hacker is basically doing things very methodically, very slowly, with a lot of time lapse between different steps, so that the system doesn't detect a lot of activity. And unless there's something out there that is actually looking for those kinds of changes, it's very unlikely that they'll see it. Healthcare is also one of our critical infrastructures in this country, as I think everybody understands. And one of the other reasons that we believe we've seen some of the attacks that we've seen that involve nation-state actors like China's Panda Group in particular, was because attacking other countries' infrastructures is part of the cyber warfare mentality of a lot of these countries, and China's in particular. One of the interesting things about the Ukrainian attack that occurred earlier this year and later last year, where they took down the power grid in a region in the Ukraine, was that attack then caused individuals to take a look at our own power grid infrastructure, and interestingly enough, then turned around, the group called CrowdStrike actually published a report that demonstrated how fragile our own power grid is, and that there are multiple points in our power grid that, if attacked, could actually take down large segments of our power system in the U.S. And that Ukrainian hack was very effective at creating a blackout, not by infecting those systems at that power station, and then allowing the hackers to gain access to or control those controls, which they could then turn the power down. What's interesting about this, as I said, is when they talk to the Department of Energy, and we looked at our own system, it was apparent that we have a great degree of risk involved in our own systems. Fraud is another big issue that we have that's driving a lot of our cybercrime out there. Fraud loss is a huge number in this country. Healthcare accounts for last number somewhere in the neighborhood of 50 to 60 billion in just healthcare identity theft alone. As I said earlier, we've seen this increase about 20% every year, and it's amazing that we don't do a better job of watching what insiders or people are doing that have access to our information. It's not just insiders anymore. It was insiders, about 70% of it was insiders up until a couple of years ago. Now we see various malware attacks and cyber attacks that are infecting systems and taking advantage of the ability to commit fraud, steal the data for committing fraud purposes as well. Uber, as you all know, Uber's one of those new social transportation carriers that we have out there. It was interesting that Uber got in trouble not too long ago when they were being interviewed by a reporter at their New York headquarters, and when she arrived in an Uber car and got out, the vice president of Uber that was there said, "There you are, I was tracking you." And she later found out, based on that interview, that Uber actually tracks all of the people that ride with them, and was actually presenting that information on a board that their analysts were able to watch, that actually showed not only who the individual was and where they got picked up and where they were being delivered, but it showed various information about them, their financial information, etc. And at the same time, Uber also suffered a breach because it had placed a lot of its riders' financial information out in a third-party storage site called GitHub, which was then compromised, and the state of New York actually went after them for both of these and found them guilty. And part of their settlement is that they have to improve their encryption and their access controls and apply two-factor authentication on their riders' information in order to make it harder for someone to get access to that information. What's interesting is that we have several hospitals around the country who are actually using Uber now, or thinking of using Uber or Lyft or some of the others for transportation of patients to appointments. And one of the things that is of interest in there is what happens to that patient information, what is being shared with them, and what is Uber keeping track of, or these other companies keeping track of with respect to the patient information in terms of who the patient is and where the patient is going, and does that create any issues? And there are a lot of these third-party systems that are beginning to collect information that are related to health purposes, that there's a lot of questions in Washington now and the legal community around, are these creating privacy issues that we're not aware of? Talk about reliability of vendors. Juniper, which is one of the most well-known network device and security firewall companies out there that we have, had to admit that they had continued to use the compromised encryption algorithm that was compromised literally 8 years ago, and that they continued to use it even after it was compromised and even after it became public knowledge that it was compromised, which therefore put anybody who was using a Juniper system at risk. Interestingly enough, they did not admit to this until independent investigators actually tested this and found out that this was true and made it public information. The question, though, is how many vendors, what do we really know about our vendors with respect to how they're building their systems or how they're managing their systems and how well they're using things that they should be? And we found over and over again that vendors who claim they have encryption in their systems, in fact, do not have encryption that actually meets the standard or that's acceptable. The insider threat I've already talked about a little bit. I'm not going to belabor it, but the insider threat includes not only insiders in terms of this young lady here, but it also includes staff that are associated with vendors who are working on systems in our provider environments. And providers are becoming more and more conscious of the fact that a lot of the incidents they're having are as a result of an employee of a third party who actually does something on their system or a third-party managed system that actually impacts their network, and they're becoming more and more concerned about that and the level of access those people have. And so they're beginning to deploy technologies at the perimeter and elsewhere that force the vendors to authenticate and that allow them to audit that individual and what they're doing in their environment while they're there. Mobile security, a big issue for our healthcare systems. All the estimates that I've seen from the different threat organizations that monitor these kinds of things feel that this is probably going to be the largest attack vector going forward, that the threat is going to increasingly shift to these mobile devices because they know that a lot of these mobile devices are not being engineered properly with security, and they're not being managed properly, and that a lot of times the controls may be good on the network, but they're not good on the endpoint or the endpoint device. And if they can compromise the endpoint device and the endpoint device has a legitimate connection to the network, then they still get access to the network. Medical devices themselves, bottom line is we have a lot of guidance out there with respect to medical devices, but we still have a huge number of medical devices that are insecure. We've known this since they were first connected to networks. We have demonstrated it year after year for the last 6 years, and we have yet to take definitive action to protect or to ensure that these devices are secure before they're connected to our network. We have applications that are deployed by third-party vendors into our hospital environments that cannot accept antivirus protection, that cannot accept any kind of security controls. And all that does is increases the vulnerability or the risk that the covered entity has to manage and own. So how do we respond to this? Well, first of all, we need to expect a smart defense. And what I mean by that is it starts initially by doing the right blocking and tackling in terms of addressing the things that make it harder for the threat to take advantage, like things like patching and fixing and hardening systems properly, and ensuring that we select technologies that have the right level of engineering in terms of protection associated with them, and the right vendor relationships with respect to vendors who are doing the right things in terms of their environments. And that means actually having some form of diligence around how we determine that before we contract with them. Making sure that preparedness is a priority. No matter what you do, no matter how well you prepare or protect and defend, there is always going to be a residual amount of risk that gets through, and we need to be prepared to respond to that. And the best defense against any of these attacks is a well-prepared organization that has a credible recovery strategy. And that's the difference between the organizations that have had these ransomware attacks recently and the ones and have not gone down or have not ended up in the news, and the ones who have had them and have actually been faced with very disruptive downtimes. The difference was how fast they could detect it and how well they could respond and rebuild their environment. You need good discipline in when we do this. One of the other things that we've learned in several of these cases is that it wasn't just that they were prepared, but that they were able to actually execute very effectively when the incident occurred. They had teams that knew what they were supposed to do. They had plans that were actually credible and had been practiced beforehand. And they had good procedures for how they did what they did, and it was very logical, and they were able to do it in a very, very effective and very responsive manner. Those who didn't have good plans or weren't very familiar with them or hadn't really exercised them tended to be less effective and tended to take them longer to respond, and therefore allowed whatever the attack was to propagate further in their environment, making it harder for them to clean it up. We need to make sure we don't forget the people that are out there, because all of our technology and all of our security efforts cannot do it alone. We need our people to help us, and this means educating them better. We need to have more education and more experiential education for them that enables them to identify potential threats or potential situations that don't make sense to them, and so they react to them properly. So they're not just clicking on things out there without thinking first that, do I need to check this before I actually click on it? But they actually look at the mail that they're getting that they don't recognize and examine it, or actually call somebody in security and say, I got this email. Because a couple of minutes delay in asking that question can mean the difference between a several hours delay in having to clean up the system if that message is actually infected. And we need to adopt an offensive posture when it comes to cybersecurity and cyber threat. We have to do a number of things and take the battle back to the cyber criminal, because they are going to continue to come. They are going to continue to get more sophisticated, and they're going to be relentless in trying to get to our data, which they've found ways to now monetize, and so it's valuable to them. So we need to educate and inform our folks. We need to make sure that our environments are as up to date as possible, We need to deploy layers and complementary controls and the right types of detection capability, next generation firewalls, malware filters that are looking for anomalous signatures, if you will, external organizations that are monitoring our environment and making it faster for us to recognize when things are not as they should be. And then last but not least, having good contingency plans and being ready to react to those incidents and to address them quickly and limit the impact. So what is it a lot of our covered entities are beginning to do with respect to their vendors that you can expect more of? Well, for one, they recognize that a good number of the issues that they're having are coming from the vendor community and the folks that are connected to them that are providing services, and so they're paying more attention to them. They are looking harder at who is a business associate and who isn't, and what that means, and they're putting vendor lifecycle management programs in place that actually look harder at the requirements that they define from a security perspective and how they select tools and services. They're looking at better or more accurate pre-contract due diligence with respect to security specifications and security checklists and vetting as part of the RFP process. They're looking at putting more security requirements into their contracts themselves and addressing the indemnification issues that may be associated with breaches. And they're looking at technologies that allow them to monitor the overall health of their vendor community and the procedures that they need to have in place that when it's time to terminate that contract to ensure that they don't have issues there. And last but not least, they're looking to have very well-defined procedures in place for breaches when they occur, so that they can react to those things very effectively. So what do we expect in the future? First of all, the Internet of Things, which includes not only those network devices or connected devices, but other smart devices are in our environment. Things like HVAC, for instance, that we don't even think about because it's associated with the air conditioning or the air handling systems, et cetera. All of these systems now are connected to the network, and they provide avenues into the network that then can create avenues for the hacker to create risk. Ransomware will continue to be successful in targeting healthcare, and will continue to come after healthcare in a big way. Because the hackers have learned that not only is it a very successful attack platform from a financial perspective, but it's also one of the things that is very impactful. Medical device and wearable hacks will surface in a big way going forward. They believe that they've already seen the increase in number of attacks against mobile devices, and they think that's going to increase even more. And we believe that they believe that cybercrime as a service, meaning organizations, criminal organizations, will be able to go to that marketplace that I talked about earlier, and request folks who will carry out those attacks for them for financial gain. What does that mean for us as an industry? It means that we have to take a different approach. We have to realize that people are willing to attack healthcare, that we do have information that's of incredible value to that element, and that the threat is becoming far more superior and sophisticated than it was in the past. It's going to take a greater level of investment for our organizations to protect their systems, and we're going to have to be far more diligent with our third-party relationships and our vendors. And a lot of our health systems, like I said, are now looking at vendor management platforms that allow them to essentially measure how well the vendors that they're working with are performing against a defined security metric, so that they can feel confident that the people that they're sharing information with and that they're connecting to and relying on are going to be there when they need them, and they're doing a good job in protecting their data and their environment. And Dennis, with that, I'm going to turn it back to you for questions.
Well, Mac, first of all, thank you. Very informative, almost a little scary. We got a lot of questions, and I think in the last 5 or 10 minutes you answered many of them. And I know we're running out of time, but I've got a couple here I just wanted to make sure that we can use, which is someone asked early in the presentation, why is medical information such a target? How would a cyber criminal use medical records information to make money?
So the first thing that is important to appreciate about medical information is that we are the only industry that actually combines all forms of protected individual information into a single database. If you go to the government, if you go to the finance sector or other retail sector, et cetera, they'll have a subset of information that's related to an individual. That may be his credit card information, maybe his bank information, loan information, et cetera. But they don't have a complete picture of an individual across the board. Whereas in healthcare, we have your health information, we have your financial information, we have, in many cases, your credit card information. We have we have all the different forms of information in a single database. So when I steal information from a hospital or from an insurer, I have a lot of information that I can turn around and monetize very quickly on the black market. I can sell Social Security numbers, I can sell your address, I can sell your maiden name, I can sell your...
I get it now. I myself did not know that credit card information was in electronic health records. Well, one last question, Mac. I think a lot of folks on the line, supply chain professionals, are concerned on a topic that you mentioned before, which is the connection of all these medical devices into a system, whether it's IV pumps and other devices with technology. Should supply chain professionals that are engaged in procuring these pieces of technology, should they engage their internal IT people in the selection of that technology as well, particularly around this topic of data security?
They should. One of the things I say is, clearly we want these medical devices to be owned and directed by the operator or whoever it is that's employing them and using them. But the actual aspects of these devices in terms of how they are set up and configured and attached to the network is very much a technical thing. And the folks in your IT team should be very much involved in that. There's also very well-defined guidance that the FDA has now put out as a result of a lot of the discussion that's gone on in the last 5 years around these devices, and for the manufacturers, for the consumer, in terms of how to set them up properly, and for the network folks in terms of communications around the radio frequencies and that sort of thing. They should be familiar with that guidance, and that guidance should be part of their selection as well as deployment strategy. So in other words, if you're looking at a vendor who's selling a pump as an example, one of the things that I would want to know is how well does your pump adhere to that guidance, so that I know right up front if I have any issues or any risks that I need to take into consideration when I get ready to deploy it.
Mac, this has been great. Really, really appreciate your sharing with the SMI community, your thoughts and insights on cybersecurity and things that supply chain folks should be concerned with. I want to remind all of our attendees that as we end this webinar, they will be seeing a survey, and we appreciate it if everybody could participate and fill out that survey. And I'll also be distributing these slides to all of the attendees on today's webinar. We went over about 10 minutes, and that's not bad because it's a good topic and worthy of a deeper dive like this. But again, Mac, I want to thank you. I want to thank all of our attendees for being here today. And with that, Mac will adjourn this webinar. And again, thanks everyone very much for being with us today.
Thank you for being here.
Thanks, Mac. Bye-bye now.